you ever wondered if there's a right number of strands of embroidery thread to use for your cross-stitch projects? Well, I guess there is, but that answer might vary depending on the project and the personal preferences of the cross-stitcher. So today I want to talk about what difference it makes to use different numbers of strands and the factors that you might want to consider when choosing the number of strands for each project. Hi there stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your stitching. If you have a cross-stitch kit or pattern, then that will usually tell you how many strands of thread to use for full cross stitches and backstitch. But that doesn't mean that you can't change that up to suit your personal preference. And today I'm going to talk about some of the things that you might want to consider if you are going to be changing the number of strands that you cross stitch with. So let's start right at the beginning with the concept of skeins and strands, so we're all on the same page. So embroidery thread, or floss if you prefer, comes like this, and this is called a skein, or skein, or however you pronounce it, because we're definitely not going to get into that here. You'll also see it called stranded cotton, and that refers to the fact that each skein of thread is made up of 6 individual strands. So to cross stitch, you'll separate each individual strand out and then combine however many you're going to use back together. So when I say one strand, this is what I'm talking about. It's a single strand pulled out from the bundle of 6 strands that make up the skein. Now, if you find it tricky to pull thread from the skein or to separate the strands without it becoming a tangled mess, then I've got a video showing you how to do that really quickly and easily. So I'll pop a link in the description for that for you. Now, another bit of terminology that you might come across when talking about number of strands to use is how many blocks or threads of fabric you're stitching over. So you might hear someone say, oh, I'm stitching with 1/2. This is basically if you're stitching X over Y, then X is the number of thread strands that you're using, and Y is the number of fabric blocks or threads that you're stitching over. Now, this refers more generally to even weave and linen, because as you can see on Ada, because of the blocks of fabric, you're generally stitching over one block. So you would be stitching over 1 on Ada. But you could be using different number of strands for that. So you could be stitching 2 over 1 on Ada. So that's 2 strands over 1 block of Ada. Now for even weave or linen, you have the choice of stitching over 1 thread of the fabric or 2 threads of the fabric. So you could be stitching 1 over 1, using 1 strand of thread over 1 thread of fabric. Or you could be stitching 2 over 2, so you'd be using 2 strands of thread over 2 threads of fabric. Okay, so why does it matter? The main reason is simply that the number of strands you use will dictate what your finished stitching looks like. The more strands you use, the more the fabric will be covered and the denser your stitches will look. And there's no right or wrong way for your cross-stitching to look. It's all a matter of personal preference. Some cross-stitchers will love really plump stitches with no fabric showing underneath, and others don't mind a bit of fabric showing because they like to see those defined cross-stitches on the fabric. The other thing to consider here is ease of stitching, because the more strands you use, particularly on higher count fabrics, the more difficult it might be to get your needle and thread through the holes of the fabric, because on higher count the holes will be smaller, and with more strands you've got increased thread thickness. And it might make it harder to thread your needle as well. So let's take a look at what difference it makes to use different numbers of strands on different counts of fabric. So these are the samples that I stitched on Ada, using the 3 most commonly used fabric counts, and you can see the number of strands I used underneath each little heart. This really clearly shows how the stitches get more dense and cover more or even all of the fabric as the number of strands used goes up. I also definitely noticed it being harder to stitch with 4 strands on 14 count Ada and 3 strands on 16 and 18 count Ada. It was just so much harder to get the needle and thread through the holes, and I think the end result is less neat too. I also stitched a sample on 32 count even weave, stitching over 2, and you can see that here compared with the sample on 16 count Ada. And they look basically the same as each other in terms of fabric coverage and stitch density, which you would expect because stitching on 1 over 16 count Ada gives you the same stitch size as over 2 on 32 count even weave. Now, while I was stitching the samples, I thought I'd show you the difference between stitching over 2 and over 1 on even weave. And I only did 1 strand for this, because that was quite tricky enough, so I absolutely was not going to attempt more strands. I wouldn't even recommend stitching 1 over 1 on 32 count, unless you want to go cross-eyed. But I did just want to show you what it looks like. If your head is spinning slightly at this point, and you want something a bit more definitive to work from, then I've put together this table, with generally recommended number of strands to use for each count of fabric, which should give you a really good starting point. You'll see that even within the table, there is a range of strand options for each count, to take account of personal preferences. So starting with the 11 count, I didn't stitch any samples for this, but the general recommendation is to use 3 or 4 strands. I've seen some sources recommend up to 6 strands, but I feel this could be really quite tricky to stitch with. For 14 count Aida or 28 count even weave or linen stitched over 2, the recommendation is 2 to 3 strands. And although I do like the extra coverage of 3 strands, I only ever use 2 because it's easier as I can use a loop start. But I will generally railroad both arms to get better fabric coverage. And if I've completely lost you there with loop start or railroading, then I'll link my videos on both of those techniques in the description below. For 16 count Aida or 28 count even weave or linen stitched over 2, the recommendation is 2 strands, and this is what I do. This also explains why these are my favourite counts of fabric to work with, because I don't have to think about how many strands I'm going to use. It's just always 2. The fabric coverage is great, the stitches look nicely dense, and it's not difficult at all to stitch with. So it's basically perfect. For 18 count Aida, the recommendation is 1 or 2 strands. And although I rarely stitch on 18 count, I do use 2 strands as I feel the coverage and density of the stitches does look nicer. For 22 count hardanger, the recommendation is to use 1 strand, and although I've never stitched on this, it makes total sense to me as the stitches would be pretty small. And finally, 25 count even weave or linen is a favourite for stitching large full coverage designs, and those would generally be stitched over 1. So the recommendation is to use 1 or 2 strands, but I can tell you from personal experience that 2 strands is really hard work to stitch with, and I only ever use 1 strand for this. Now, there are some situations where you might like to consider using on the higher end of the number of strands that's recommended. And for me, one of those is stitching on perforated paper, because perforated paper is 14 count, but the holes are quite big. So 2 strands versus 3 strands, I think the 3 looks actually much better, so I will use 3 strands on perforated paper. The other one is stitching on dark fabric, because the fabric can show through more, especially if you're using light colours on the dark fabric. Now, I tend to still use 2 strands, because I use 16 count fabric, so it's not going to be quite as bad from a coverage point of view, and also because I'm lazy. And you can see there is still a little bit of fabric showing through here, and I don't mind that, but if you wanted better coverage, then you could use 3 strands. The other situation is for any thin threads, such as some unbranded threads. But you have to be really careful here, because if it's a kit that you're doing and you use more than the recommended number of strands, then you could run out of thread. But if you're stitching with thin feeling threads and using a PDF pattern, then go for it. You can always increase the number of strands compared to what's recommended. Now we've covered cross stitches, let's talk about backstitch. I'm much more likely to stick to the recommendations in a kit or a pattern for the number of strands to use for backstitch, because this has often been carefully chosen to give the best finished effect for the design. But you can adjust it if you wish. I will say to carefully check how many strands are needed for backstitch, because some kits or patterns will use different numbers of strands for different sections of backstitch to create dimension. So I've seen patterns that use 1, 2, or even 3 strands of backstitch all in the same design. So definitely read your pattern carefully. A general rule of thumb that I find quite useful is that the more strands that you use for full cross stitches, the more strands I would consider using for backstitch, just so the backstitch doesn't get kind of lost into the full cross stitches. So a good example of this is when I stitch on perforated paper compared to a flat pattern. Because a flat pattern I would generally use 1 strand for the backstitch, but on perforated paper I do like to use 2 strands because I feel it stands out better. So I realise that's been quite a lot to think about, but I would start with your kit or pattern and looking at the number of recommended strands to use. And then look at the count of fabric that you're using, consider those guidelines that we talked about earlier, and decide what you want to use. And if you're not sure about anything, you can always make a few stitches on the corner of your fabric with different numbers of strands, just to see what you like the look of and what's easiest for you to stitch. Now I've also put all of this into a handy PDF quick reference guide for you, so I'll put a link to that in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, then give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe so you stay in the loop for all the good stitchy stuff to come. Thank you so much for watching and happy stitching!